After reading the book Will Africa Feed China, written by Deborah Brautigam, we decided to get to know the author better because her story is very full and inspiring. Our project will be based on the book itself, on the interview with Yale University, as well as on Deborah Brautigam's review on her book for USC US China Institute. To make our project full and revealing, first we will tell you about the main idea of the book in the presentation format. This will be something like the reader's view, and then we will present for viewing the imitations of the interview with Deborah Brautigam, since we believe that her personal story is an integral part of the book, and in order to fully reveal it, you need to know origins. Deborah Brautigam is a specialist in China and Africa. She succeeded in destroying myths, eloquently and firmly refuting preconceived notions about the nature of the Chinese presence in African countries. Her ambitious myth-busting work continues to this day in her blog China in Africa, The Real Story. The book consists of 8 chapters that deal with various aspects of the Chinese presence in Africa related to agriculture. The chapters are chock full of truly researched and accessible comparative case studies. Brautigam's account of many misleading stories about the Chinese presence in Africa shows that we all need to exercise caution and a critical approach when forming opinions and conclusions, and not just from the point of view of Sino-African relations. Will Africa Feed China? Indeed, it contains some myth-busting, dispelling entrenched narratives such as the Chinese want to grow food in Africa and send it back to China, and Beijing plans to send displaced farmers to Africa. The key principle of the book is comparative political economic argumentation. It's clear that for Brautigam, African countries should welcome investment in the agricultural sector in order to benefit from technological modernization and innovation, and thus be able to be better integrated into global value chains. Brautigam relies on a large number of case studies to show how Asian agricultural processing companies have grown due to expansion abroad. Nevertheless, according to Brautigam, investments in themselves are not a panacea for development. They should also be led by an active state. As Brautigam notes, the ability of African states to actively participate in solving any social problems, including foreign direct investment, in the agricultural sector was radically undermined during the years of structural adjustment, and the consequences of this are still being felt. This is a compelling and much needed argument that Brautigam puts forward in terms of Africa's development and how China can contribute to it. However, it makes us wonder what the consequences are from a business and human rights perspective. Brautigam touches on aspects of cui bono to some extent in the book. She notes that Chinese investors have, in some cases, violated the land rights of small farmers in Africa. For Chinese companies, Brautigam explains, land rights and public relations are the prerogative of states, not foreign investors. Indeed, the Chinese understanding of sovereignty remains strictly non-interventionist, which means that neither Chinese diplomats nor Chinese investors will interfere in what they consider to be the responsibility of the host government. Therefore, Chinese companies were poorly prepared to solve the difficult situation with land ownership in many African countries, where states sometimes lease land without paying compensation to small farmers.
This book addresses 4 widely held beliefs regarding Chinese agricultural participation in Africa that have created accepted thinking and spread in political circles and modern culture. The Chinese are not only very active players in this arena, but they are almost the only ones amongst the big countries. Nowadays, people do not have a guaranteed property right in nations with poor law and order, including China. In Africa, on the other hand, Most agricultural land is limited in order to survive. The author discusses her story and how she worked on the book thoroughly. After years of hard work, the author was appointed director of the China-Africa Research Program. China's aid program has developed nearly 90 farms in Africa. However, China State Farms Agribusiness Corporation only returned to manage or lease 4 farms, and they all failed. There was no great scheme to fund the farms with Chinese aid so that they might be controlled by a Chinese corporation shipping food to China decades later. These farms were established to feed Africans. Employees of the China-Africa Agricultural Investment Company revealed that CSFAC was not viewed positively in Beijing. However, as far as we can tell, China-Africa Agricultural Investment Corporation's own quest for investment projects has been unsuccessful. To summarize, China's accomplishments and influence in Africa are exaggerated, as are the intentions to shift labor and export products to China. The collection of rubber plantations, primarily in Cameroon, is by far the greatest Chinese agricultural investment in Africa.
Talking about myths, the author gave us 4 common myths about China at the beginning of the book. The first one was that the Chinese have acquired large areas of farmland. The second one is the Chinese government is leading this effort through its state-owned firms and sovereign wealth funds. The third one is that the Chinese are growing grain for export to China. And the last one, the Chinese have sent or plan to send large number of Chinese farmers to settle on the continent. Talking about reality. In reality, Chinese government did not purchase a large amount of land in Africa. Only 40,000 hectares were purchased. That's hardly much for agriculture, especially on such a large continent as Africa. The answer for the third myth is no. A large portion of the produce produced on Chinese farms in Africa is sold on the local market to feed the local population rather than the Chinese in their homeland, where rice is available. And talking about the fourth myth, there was no plan in place for Chinese farmers to immigrate. Many notable businesses talked about it and welcomed the idea, but there was no plan and no way to quickly deploy millions of Chinese to work in Africa. In China, for example, someone wrote, "Many people from my province are going to Russia to grow vegetables."
Food costs increased dramatically over the world during the first decade of the 21st century, and China was similarly affected. The welfare state and population expanded rapidly, yet there was a shortage of arable land. However, in the case of Africa, the land was present, but its security and stability were in doubt. As a result, when China began working on African land, the world assumed that China was using Africa to grow food to send home and feed its people. This book demonstrates that China played a different role. The Chinese are not attempting to establish a new empire on the continent. Interestingly, despite a number of problems, Africa's prosperity indicators are rising, such as Ebola, other diseases, and conflicts between countries. The African continent has a growing middle class. Despite all of Africa's advancements, the food situation is critical. African food production does not indicate signs of modernization. Low and declining yields, rapid population growth, and the effects of climate change mean that Africa will only be able to meet 13% of its food needs by 2050. The Chinese are concerned about food security. As China's cities grew in the 1990s, food problems arose. The press went into a panic mode, and author Lester Brown even wrote a book titled "Who Will Feed China?" The Chinese government then took action. They established targets for basic wheat self-sufficiency. China would feed China. To accomplish this, they meticulously contacted the international market, and foreign investors, allowing them to modernize their own agriculture. Competition was crucial in the development of their own agriculture. Many foreign food companies entered the Chinese market, forcing local businesses to compete. China's confidence in food security is now underpinned by its role as a food aid provider. Thanks to the government's actions, China can now support itself. In this regard, Africa is not so optimistic. Africa already relies on global markets and foreign aid to feed its people, making food security a function of limited foreign exchange and charity contributions. Thanks for watching.